I'm sharing this experience because I want people to be more careful when they're alone at night, especially at rest areas. This happened not too long ago in Virginia while I was traveling with my dad, who's a truck driver. I had joined him for a few days on the road because I'm interested in getting my CDL in the future and wanted to get a feel for what the job is like. We're from Maryland, so the drive wasn't too bad, and we arrived the same day. The delivery was scheduled for early the next morning, so sometime around midnight, maybe between 12 and 1 a.m., we pulled into a rest area for the night. The parking lot was packed with trucks, but the rest area itself felt strangely deserted. Most of the drivers were probably asleep in their cabs, trying to get some rest before their deliveries. The whole place had that quiet, late-night atmosphere where every sound seems louder than it should be. As soon as we parked, my dad went straight to sleep. I'm naturally a night owl, so I stayed awake. Around 2 a.m., I decided to use the restroom. I brought my electric razor with me because I wanted to line up my mustache. Since it was so late, I figured the restroom would be empty and I'd have a few minutes to myself. The restroom was split into two sections, one on the left and one on the right. When I walked into the left side, I noticed a man standing near one of the urinals. He was extremely tall, probably around 6 feet 4 inches. I didn't think much of it at first. I went into a stall, used the bathroom, and then washed my hands. What caught my attention was that when I finished, the man was still standing there. Just as I was about to leave, he unzipped his pants and stepped up to the urinal. Something about the timing felt odd. Not alarming, just strange. I couldn't explain why, but it gave me a slight sense of discomfort. Instead of leaving, I walked over to the restroom section on the right and stood in front of the mirror to line up my mustache. About 10 seconds later, the same man walked into that side. That was the moment my stomach tightened. Maybe there was an innocent explanation, but I couldn't think of one. He had already been on the other side, and there was no obvious reason for him to follow me into an otherwise empty restroom. As I stood there with my razor, I watched him approach through the mirror. Then he suddenly stopped. The expression on his face changed the instant he noticed the razor in my hand. He looked genuinely surprised, almost shocked, like something hadn't gone the way he expected. Looking back, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that's honestly how it felt in the moment. My anxiety immediately spiked. I kept trimming my mustache as calmly as I could, trying not to make it obvious that I was watching him through the mirror. Every instinct was telling me to leave, but I also didn't want to panic or do something that might escalate the situation. A few seconds later, he walked to a urinal and pretended to unzip his pants. I say pretended, because when I glanced back at him, he wasn't looking down. He wasn't focused on the urinal at all. He was staring directly at me. The eye contact lasted long enough to make me uncomfortable. Then he gave me a small nod. I nodded back automatically, not because I felt friendly or relaxed, but because I didn't want him to think I was scared or suspicious. At that point, I had a growing feeling that he knew I was paying attention to him, and I didn't want to provoke anything. A few moments later, he stepped into an empty stall. Something made me look over again. When I did, I saw him standing completely still in the far corner of the stall, staring straight at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He wasn't using the restroom. He wasn't moving. He was just watching me. A chill ran through me. I immediately looked away and pretended I hadn't noticed. Part of me kept trying to come up with a normal explanation. But another part of me was becoming increasingly convinced that something was seriously wrong. About 20 seconds later, he left the stall and returned to the urinal. Once again, he briefly acted as though he was going to use it, glanced toward me, and then turned away. The whole thing felt like some kind of performance. As soon as I finished lining up my mustache, I decided I was done. I wasn't interested in finding out what his intentions were. I headed toward the exit while keeping the razor in my hand. I wasn't planning to use it, but it gave me a small sense of security. To get out, I had to walk directly past him, and that made me nervous. I'm not a small guy. I'm about 5 feet 9 inches. But this man towered over me. He looked at least 20 years older than I was, probably somewhere in his late 30s or 40s, and significantly bigger. If things had turned physical, I honestly don't think I'd have had much of a chance. I walked out without saying a word. The second I stepped outside, I noticed security cameras mounted near the entrance. Seeing them brought an immediate sense of relief. For the first time since the man had followed me into the other side of the restroom, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The man didn't follow me outside. The moment I realized that, a wave of relief washed over me. I hadn't even noticed how tense I was until then. My shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in several minutes, I felt like I could breathe normally again. I looked across the parking lot toward my dad's truck. He was still asleep, just like the dozens of other truck drivers parked around us. The entire rest area seemed peaceful from the outside, which somehow made what had just happened feel even stranger. I texted a friend and told him everything. About 20 minutes later, he finally replied. After hearing the story, he suggested that I go back into the restroom while on FaceTime with him. Looking back, I'm not entirely sure why I agreed to do that. Maybe I wanted reassurance. Maybe I wanted proof that I hadn't exaggerated what had happened in my head. It's either way, I went back. The restroom was completely empty. The man was gone. While on the call, I walked my friend through everything that had happened. I showed him where the man had first been standing, where he had followed me, where he had stared at me from inside the stall, and where I had been standing at the mirror. Saying it all out loud made the situation feel even more unsettling. The more I described it, the less normal it sounded. After about 5 minutes, I left the restroom again and ended the call because my friend had to go. As I stepped outside, something else caught my attention. Behind the rest area was a separate parking lot for passenger vehicles. Most of it was dark, but one red car stood out because its headlights were on. In fact, it was the only vehicle illuminated in the entire lot. I glanced toward it. The instant I did, the headlights shut off immediately. I froze for a second. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the driver had just parked. Maybe they were about to leave. Maybe they had simply turned the lights off at that exact moment. I honestly don't know. But the timing felt wrong. The darkness swallowed the vehicle almost instantly, and from that distance, I couldn't see who was inside. Part of me wondered whether it could have been the same man from the restroom. Another part of me knew there was no way to know for sure. Even now, I can't say those events were connected. What bothered me was how perfectly the timing lined up. I stared at the car for a few seconds before finally deciding to head back to the truck. My dad was still asleep. Nothing else happened that night. No one approached me. No one followed me. No doors opened. No voices called out. Eventually, the rest of the night passed without incident, and life went back to normal. The strange thing is that I never told my dad about any of it. At the time, I was 17 years old, and he had only recently started allowing me to go places by myself. He's always been strict, and I knew exactly how he would react if I told him the story. There was a good chance I'd lose that freedom immediately. I could already imagine him deciding that I wasn't allowed to wander off alone anymore until I turned 18. Since I was so close to adulthood, I kept the whole thing to myself. The only person who ever heard the full story was my friend. Over the following weeks, I tried to come up with a logical explanation. The man didn't look homeless. He didn't appear intoxicated. He wasn't dirty, disheveled, or behaving like someone under the influence. He had clean clothes, a trimmed beard, and generally looked like an ordinary person. That's part of what made the experience so unsettling. Nothing about his appearance seemed unusual. Only his behavior. To this day, I still don't know what he was doing. Maybe he was mentally unwell. Maybe there was some explanation I failed to understand. Maybe I completely misread the situation. I've considered all of those possibilities. But no matter how much I try to rationalize it, I can't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The way he followed me, the way he kept watching me, the way he stood motionless in that stall. None of it felt normal. And the thought that still creeps into my mind years later is wondering what might have happened if I hadn't been holding that razor. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything would have unfolded exactly the same way. Or maybe seeing it in my hand made him rethink whatever he had planned. I'll never know. What I do know is that ever since that night, I've paid much closer attention to my surroundings. I'm far more aware of unusual behavior, and I rarely go anywhere alone late at night unless I absolutely have to. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I wasn't. But that experience taught me that when something feels wrong, it's usually worth paying attention to that feeling. The story I'm about to tell is genuinely one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. And it's a perfect example of how an ordinary night can suddenly turn into a real-life nightmare. These events happened a few years ago when I was 21. I'm almost 28 now, but I still remember the details vividly. In fact, what makes the whole thing so unsettling is that even after all these years, I still can't fully explain what happened that night. For some context, I live in a relatively large city in the Pacific Northwest. My neighborhood is made up of small houses and a few residential buildings. There's nothing particularly unusual about it. No abandoned properties, no dangerous streets, no local urban legends. If anything, it's a pretty boring place most of the time. One of the reasons I always felt comfortable there was because I knew almost everyone. Most of my neighbors had lived there for years, and seeing familiar faces every day gave the area a strong sense of safety. At the time, my life was incredibly repetitive. I would go to university, attend lectures, come home, study for exams, get some sleep, and then repeat the same routine again the next day. Weeks would pass like that. I barely had any free time. Then one Friday, my parents told me they were visiting relatives in another city. They planned to leave that afternoon, stay through Saturday, and return sometime on Sunday. For me, that meant one thing. I had the entire house to myself for the weekend. At 21 years old, that sounded pretty amazing. I've always enjoyed being home alone. Even as a kid, I liked having the house to myself. The quiet, the freedom, not having to worry about anyone else being around. It also seemed like the perfect opportunity to finally spend some time with my friends. Since I was always studying, we rarely got the chance to hang out anymore. So I called them and suggested we get together on Saturday. The plan was simple. Order food, play video games, talk about life. Just enjoy having a free evening for once. Everything was set. Well, almost everything. There was one thing I had completely forgotten about. That Friday evening, my university was hosting its annual geography quiz competition. I had already promised several classmates that I'd participate, so backing out wasn't really an option. Besides, I didn't have any other plans that night. And if I'm being honest, geography quizzes were kind of my thing. I've always been good at them. So I went. The event ended up being much bigger than I expected. A group of 6 of us formed a team, and there were 10 teams competing all together. The student hall was absolutely packed. I remember being surprised by how many people showed up. The atmosphere was fantastic. There was free food, free drinks, and everyone seemed to be having a genuinely good time. For a while, I completely forgot about exams and responsibilities. The night flew by. Before I knew it, we were answering the final question. Then came the results. To our surprise, we finished second out of all 10 teams. We received a small prize, took some photos together, and celebrated for a few minutes before everyone started heading home. Eventually, my friends and I said our goodbyes. I hurried toward the subway station because I needed to catch the last train. Unfortunately, public transportation in my city doesn't run all night. Once you miss the final subway, you're pretty much out of luck. Thankfully, I made it. A short while later, I stepped off at my station and began the 10-minute walk back home. It was early October, and the temperature had started to drop. The air felt cold. Not freezing, but cold enough that I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. By that point, the excitement from the quiz had worn off. I was exhausted. All I could think about was getting home, making some microwave noodles, and collapsing into bed. The streets were mostly empty. The city had that late-night feeling where everything seems quieter than usual. Not completely silent. Just still. Then it happened. A scream suddenly shattered the silence. Not a yell. Not someone calling for help. A scream. The loudest, most blood-curdling scream I had ever heard in my life. I froze instantly. Every muscle in my body locked up. The sound was unmistakably human. A man's voice. But it didn't sound like someone who was frightened. It sounded like someone who was suffering. Severe suffering. The kind of scream you would expect from someone experiencing unimaginable pain. For a split second, my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a drunk person. Maybe friends were messing around. Maybe someone was playing a prank. But the second scream destroyed every one of those explanations. There was nothing playful about it, nothing exaggerated, nothing theatrical. It sounded as though someone was being tortured, as though something terrible was happening right at that moment. The sound echoed through the empty streets, and a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. I remember standing there, completely motionless, listening. And for the first time that night, all I wanted was to get home as fast as possible. I stopped dead in my tracks. For a second, I just stood there listening, trying to figure out where the scream had come from. The whole situation felt surreal. The street was completely silent again. Most of the houses had already gone dark for the night, and the neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. Quiet, safe, and uneventful. Nothing about what I was seeing matched the sound I had just heard. Honestly, it scared me. Not because I knew what was happening, but because I had absolutely no idea what was happening. Then another scream pierced the night. This time, I managed to pinpoint the direction. My stomach immediately tightened. It was coming from the direction of my house. Without thinking much about it, I started moving faster. I wasn't running yet, but I was walking as quickly as I could. Every few seconds, I looked over my shoulder and listened carefully for movement around me. The entire neighborhood suddenly felt different. The same streets I'd walked through hundreds of times now felt unfamiliar. Every shadow seemed darker. Every corner felt threatening. As I turned right at the final corner before my house, I noticed a group of people standing in the distance. 4, maybe 5. It was hard to tell. They were roughly 200 yards away. At first, I thought nothing of it. Then they noticed me and immediately started running in my direction. My heart dropped. Even now, years later, I remember how strange that moment felt. There was no hesitation, no discussion among them. The instant they saw me, they began sprinting toward me. I remember thinking, why? Why would a group of strangers suddenly run toward a random person walking home in the middle of the night? Nothing about it made sense. Then I heard shouting. I couldn't understand the words, but I could tell they were yelling something. At that point, instinct completely took over. I ran. My house sat directly between me and the group, and thankfully, it was much closer to me than it was to them. I sprinted toward the front door. Adrenaline was pumping through my body so hard that I could barely think. I reached the door, shoved my hand into my pocket, pulled out my keys, and immediately dropped them. Just like in a horror movie. The metallic sound of them hitting the ground felt impossibly loud. For a split second, panic flooded through me. I scrambled to pick them up, my hands suddenly feeling clumsy and useless. Before unlocking the door, I made the mistake of looking back one last time. The group was closer now, close enough for me to get a better look. They appeared homeless. Their clothes were dirty and torn, hanging loosely from their bodies. Seeing them only confirmed that running had been the right decision. I shoved the key into the lock, pushed the door open, and practically threw myself inside. The second I entered, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then I locked it again, just to be sure. I stood there breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. My chest hurt. My pulse was racing, and my imagination immediately started working against me. I kept thinking they were going to appear outside the window, that they'd start pounding on the door, that they'd somehow force their way inside. The fact that my parents were out of town suddenly felt very real. For the first time that night, I truly understood that I was completely alone. I turned off the lights and stood beside the front door in darkness, listening, waiting. Every second felt stretched. The silence outside became almost unbearable. I stayed there for what felt like 20 minutes. In reality, it was probably only a couple. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, no knocking, just silence. Part of me found that reassuring. Another part found it unsettling, because it didn't make sense. A group of people had been running directly toward me moments earlier. Where had they gone? Deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger hadn't actually passed, that they were still somewhere outside, watching, waiting. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I walked over to the front window and carefully peeked outside. Nothing. The street was empty. I checked another window near the kitchen. Still nothing. Just a deserted road illuminated by a few streetlights and tree branches swaying in the cold wind. The neighborhood looked perfectly normal again. Almost too normal. At that point, I decided it was probably best to call emergency services and report everything that had happened. I dialed 112 and explained the entire situation. The screams, the group of men, the fact that they had started running toward me. To be honest, the operator didn't seem particularly concerned at first. She kept asking whether I knew the people who had chased me. I told her no, several times. Since I hadn't actually been harmed and the men hadn't reached me, there wasn't much they could immediately do. Still, after hearing the full story, she told me they would send a patrol car through the neighborhood and let me know if officers found anything suspicious. I thanked her and ended the call. Around 15 or 20 minutes later, I saw a police car slowly driving down the street outside my house. Watching those blue lights move through the neighborhood brought a surprising amount of comfort. For the first time all night, I felt somewhat safe. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me. It was well past midnight by then. My adrenaline had finally started wearing off, leaving me mentally drained. I locked everything one final time, checked the windows, and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every strange sound made me alert. Every creak in the house made me wonder whether someone was outside. But eventually I drifted off. The next morning, I tried convincing myself that the whole thing was over. I made breakfast, cleaned up a little, and did my best not to dwell on the previous night. Still, my mind kept returning to it. The screams, the group of men, the sudden silence afterward. There were so many unanswered questions. My best friend called later that morning. Apparently, another friend of ours had gotten sick and wouldn't be able to come over. So it ended up being just the two of us spending the day at my house. At the time, I thought the nightmare was behind me. I had no idea the strangest part of the story hadn't happened yet. Before my friend left that evening, I briefly mentioned what had happened the night before. I intentionally left out most of the details. I didn't want to worry him. At first, we laughed about it. The whole thing sounded almost ridiculous when summarized in a few sentences. A scream in the night, a group of strangers running toward me, a frantic sprint home. But even while joking about it, I could tell he was genuinely concerned. The look on his face gave that away. My parents called later as well. They asked the usual questions. How was I doing? Was everything okay? I told them yes, partly because I didn't want to ruin their trip, and partly because my mother worries about everything. I already knew exactly how she would react if I told her the full story over the phone. I decided I'd tell them once they got home. That night, after my friend left, I found myself going through the house one more time. I checked every door, every window, every lock. Then I checked them again. Logically, I knew I was probably being paranoid. Emotionally, I couldn't help it. Eventually, I settled into the living room and put a movie on. For the first time all weekend, I felt myself starting to relax. The events from the previous night slowly faded into the background. I became absorbed in the movie. For about an hour, everything felt normal. Then I heard it, a loud bang from outside. The sound was sudden enough to make me jump. It sounded like something had struck the side of the house, maybe a rock, maybe something else. I couldn't tell. My heart immediately started racing again. I grabbed the remote and muted the television. Then I turned it off completely. The house fell silent. I sat there listening, waiting. Nothing. Not a single sound. No voices, no footsteps, no movement outside. Just silence. After a while, I started questioning whether I'd even heard anything at all. Maybe it had been part of the movie. Maybe something shifted in the house. Maybe my imagination was running wild after everything that had happened. I honestly didn't know. What I did know was that I was tired of feeling afraid. Slowly, my fear was being replaced by frustration, and then by anger. I remember thinking, what kind of game is this? If someone was outside, why not show themselves? Why make noise and disappear? Why leave me constantly wondering? Eventually, I walked upstairs and looked through my bedroom window. My room faces the street, and from the second floor I could see a good portion of the neighborhood. Everything looked normal. The street was empty. No people, no vehicles, no signs that anyone had been there at all. I stayed awake for as long as I could, partly because I wanted answers, partly because I didn't trust myself to sleep. At some point, though, exhaustion won. I think it was around 4 in the morning when I finally drifted off. The next thing I remember is waking up to voices downstairs. For a moment, I was confused. Then I realized my family had returned. Sunlight was pouring through the window. I checked my phone. It was already around noon. I'd slept through half the day, which almost never happens to me. When I went downstairs, my parents immediately started joking about how exhausted I looked and asked me to help carry their bags inside. But after everything that had happened, I knew I couldn't keep the story to myself anymore. So I told them everything. The screams, the group chasing me, the police call, the strange noise the following night. As expected, they were horrified. My mother became worried instantly. My father was upset that I'd gone through all of that alone. But more than anything, they were relieved that I was safe. A week later, we decided to install security cameras at the front and back of the house. It seemed like the smartest thing to do. And strangely enough, after that, nothing similar ever happened again. No more screams, no strange groups of people, no suspicious noises outside, nothing. Life simply returned to normal. I never received a follow-up from the police either. No explanation, no updates, no answers. And that's the part that still bothers me all these years later. What exactly happened that night? Why did those people start running toward me? Who was the man screaming? Was he genuinely in danger? Was he a victim of something terrible? Or was the scream part of some kind of setup? I've wondered countless times whether it could have been a trap. Maybe the scream was meant to draw attention. Maybe they hoped someone would investigate. Maybe they intended to rob whoever came looking. Or maybe the reality was even worse than that. The truth is, I have no idea. And then there's the noise I heard the following night. Was it connected? Did someone actually throw something at the house? Or had the stress and lack of sleep finally started affecting my judgment? I honestly can't say. Over the years, I've replayed every detail in my head more times than I can count. Each time, I arrive at a different conclusion. Sometimes I convince myself there must be a logical explanation. Other times, the entire situation feels far more sinister. What makes the story stay with me isn't what I know. It's what I don't know. The unanswered questions, the missing pieces, the possibility that whatever happened that night came much closer to me than I ever realized. And after all this time, I've come to accept that I'll probably never know the truth. I'm a woman in my early 20s, and I've lived in the city my entire life. Because of that, navigating the transit authority at all hours has always felt completely normal to me. My commute is long, about 2 hours each way. It involves 2 trains, a 30-minute bus ride, and then a 5-block walk through a poorly lit neighborhood before I finally get home. After doing it for years, I've gotten used to it. Most nights blend together, but there are 2 nights that still stick with me. The first happened on the train. I had stepped aboard just before the doors closed, so I stayed standing near them rather than finding a seat. I had my headphones in and was listening to music when I started hearing a voice through the audio. At first, I assumed it was just another person talking to themselves. That's not exactly uncommon on the subway. But after a few moments, I realized the voice was directed at me. A homeless man sitting nearby was staring straight at me while saying something. I tried to ignore it. When he didn't stop, I pulled one earbud out and asked what he'd said. The second I did, his face twisted with anger. He called me a bitch, loudly. My stomach dropped. I still remember how suddenly my body reacted. My ears felt hot. My face felt hot. It was like every ounce of blood in my body rushed upward at once. My heart started hammering so hard that I could feel it in my chest. I looked around the train car, hoping someone else had heard him, hoping someone would at least acknowledge what was happening. I tried making eye contact with other passengers. Nobody met my gaze. Every person who looked my way quickly looked somewhere else. No one wanted involvement. No one wanted attention. And honestly, that's something you learn pretty quickly in the city. Most people keep their heads down and mind their own business, especially when someone unstable starts causing a scene. Even so, I felt completely alone in that moment. At the next stop, which wasn't even mine, I stepped off the train and immediately moved into the next car over. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. But inside, I was terrified that he'd follow me. The doors closed, and I kept glancing through the windows between the train cars. Every time the train stopped, I'd look. Every time the doors opened, I'd look. I kept waiting to see him appear, to see him step into my car, to see him realize where I'd gone. 2 stops later, I finally watched him leave the train. The moment the doors closed behind him, I felt a wave of relief. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. The unsettling thing is that this wasn't even an unusual experience by the city standards. It was just another reminder that sometimes the safest thing you can do is quietly remove yourself from a situation and hope the other person loses interest. The second incident happened a few years later while I was in grad school. I had evening classes that ended around 8:30 p.m., which meant I usually didn't get near home until after 10. Late-night bus rides always feel different from daytime ones. Quieter, more isolated, less predictable. The driver only stops when someone requests it. Conversations are rare, and everyone seems exhausted or lost in their own thoughts. That particular night, I was listening to horror stories through my headphones during the ride home. Ironically, the story I was listening to involved a woman being followed. Because of that, when I got off the bus, I lowered the volume and became unusually aware of my surroundings. My route home takes me past a few businesses before reaching a dark, residential dead-end street with terrible lighting. One of those businesses is the restaurant. As I walked past the restaurant, I briefly thought about getting some mac and cheese. I kept walking. Then, almost at the end of the block, I changed my mind and turned around. That's when I noticed him, a man who had been on the bus with me. Up until that moment, I hadn't paid attention to him at all. But the second I turned around, he stopped walking. Completely. It was almost unnatural. Like someone had hit pause. He just stood there staring at me with wide eyes. I immediately felt uneasy. Maybe he was surprised that I'd suddenly changed direction. Maybe I was overthinking it because of the horror story I'd been listening to. I tried telling myself that. Still, something about the way he froze bothered me. I went into the restaurant anyway. The restaurant was nearly empty, and because it was so late, they barely had any food left. After a minute or two, I decided it wasn't worth waiting and headed back outside. As soon as I left, I continued toward home. Everything felt normal again, until I saw him. This time, he wasn't walking. He wasn't browsing his phone. He wasn't waiting for a bus. He was standing perfectly still at the entrance to the dark street I needed to turn down, just standing there, waiting. The second I recognized him, my pace slowed. A knot formed in my stomach. Maybe he lived down that street. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe there was a completely innocent explanation. But in that moment, none of those explanations felt convincing. What bothered me wasn't simply that he was there. It was where he had chosen to stop. Of all places, he was standing exactly where I needed to go. Watching, waiting. The feeling that came over me was immediate and impossible to ignore. Without taking my eyes off him, I pulled out my phone and called my brother. My brother is almost never home, so the fact that he answered my call honestly felt like a miracle. The moment he picked up, I think he could hear something was wrong just from the way I sounded. As soon as I told him I was near the restaurant, he didn't ask a bunch of questions. He simply said, "I'm coming." Hearing that immediately made me feel a little safer. Not completely safe, but safer. Knowing my brother was on the way, I finally turned down the dark street and walked past the man. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps behind me. My stomach dropped. The man had started walking too. At first, I tried convincing myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was simply heading in the same direction. But the timing felt impossible to ignore. Every time I slowed down, he seemed to slow down. Every time I sped up, he seemed to speed up. He stayed behind me, matching my pace. Then he spoke, quietly. He told me he loved me. The words were so unexpected that for a second I wasn't even sure I'd heard them correctly. After that, he continued mumbling things under his breath. But I couldn't make out what he was saying. I didn't turn around. I didn't respond. I just kept walking. At that point, every alarm bell in my head was going off. I decided it was safer to stay somewhere with lights and people nearby than continue walking down a dark residential street with someone following me. So I turned around and headed back toward the businesses near the main road. There was a liquor store nearby, and I stopped outside. I've lived in that neighborhood long enough to recognize many of the people who usually spend time around those stores at night. As strange as it sounds, I remember actually hoping to see one of those familiar faces. Someone I recognized. Anyone. But that night, I didn't know a single person standing there. That realization made me feel even more isolated. I kept checking the street while waiting for my brother. Then the man approached me. He asked if I needed help. I said no, firmly. A few moments later, he asked again, then again. Each time, he insisted that he could help me. What bothered me wasn't the question itself. It was that he kept moving closer every time he asked. I told him no repeatedly, loudly. There was no confusion. There was no misunderstanding. If someone genuinely believes a person needs assistance, most people back off after being told no once or twice. He didn't. He kept advancing. The closer he got, the more uncomfortable I became. Then I noticed something that immediately stood out. He was wearing latex gloves. This was well after the pandemic restrictions had ended. My first thought was that if he was concerned enough about germs to wear gloves, why wasn't he wearing a face mask? And it wasn't cold outside either. The gloves looked completely out of place. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he had just come from work. Maybe he had a medical reason. I don't know. But combined with everything else that had happened, seeing them made my anxiety spike even higher. Then he started repeating something else, over and over. He kept telling me that I needed to go home, not suggesting it, not advising it, telling me. The way he said it felt less like concern and more like pressure. Almost like he wanted me to leave the safety of the well-lit area and walk back down the dark street. I remember thinking that there was absolutely no chance I was doing that. A few moments later, he finally turned and walked into the liquor store. The second I saw him move deeper inside, I took my opportunity. I immediately rounded the corner, and there was my brother, walking toward me. I don't think I've ever been so relieved to see someone in my life. The entire encounter probably lasted no more than 5 minutes, maybe even less, but it felt endless. That's the strange thing about experiences like that. When you tell the story afterward, it sounds incredibly short. A few minutes, a handful of conversations, nothing dramatic. But when you're the one living through it, when you're constantly assessing exits, watching someone's movements, wondering what their intentions are and waiting for help to arrive, time seems to slow to a crawl. Every second stretches. Every decision feels important. And years later, I still find myself replaying that night and wondering what would have happened if I hadn't turned around to go back to the restaurant. If I hadn't called my brother. Or if he hadn't answered the phone when he did.